My name is Marie. I'm sitting in a small, cozy room that I now call home, looking at the keys in my hand. These keys represent a new beginning, but they also carry the weight of a past filled with pain and confusion. I remember the day I received a call from a lawyer named Mr. Harris. He said my son, Jake, had contacted his office and wanted to meet me urgently. I was filled with a mix of dread and curiosity. Part of me wanted to ignore the call, to protect the fragile stability I had built for myself. But another part, the part that had raised Jake and trusted him with my life, knew I couldn't. When I arrived at the law office, Jake was already there. He looked so different, so thin and haggard. He turned when he heard me and his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I didn't know how else to do it." We sat down, and Mr. Harris was there, quiet but present. Jake began to explain. He told me about a debt that wasn't his, a cousin who had gotten involved in some dangerous business. There had been threats, men showing up at his work, and a car following his wife, Lily, home. They had gone to the police, but the advice was to protect the child, reduce leverage, and make it clear who had assets and who did not. They knew about the apartment I had lived in for almost 20 years. Jake said they had asked questions about me. The decision to change the locks wasn't out of cruelty, he said. It was to create distance, to make sure anyone watching would believe I had been completely cut off. Mr. Harris slid a folder across the table to me. Inside were documents, a police report, a record of the apartment sale, and bank statements showing the remaining funds transferred into a trust in my name. "We didn't touch it, Mom," Jake said quickly. "It's yours, every dollar." I stared at the papers, my vision blurring. The explanation fit together too neatly, like a puzzle finally finished. But the pain it explained didn't disappear. "You could have told me," I said quietly. Jake shook his head. "You wouldn't have played along. You would have tried to help, and that would have put you in danger." I sat back, exhaustion washing over me. He hadn't meant to destroy me, but intent didn't erase impact. "I lost my home," I said. "I lost my sense of safety." I stood in a hallway and felt disposable. "I know," he whispered. "I didn't reach for him then. I needed him to understand that love didn't excuse everything." It took time after that. Weeks of careful conversations, short visits with my grandson Ethan, who clung to me like he was afraid I'd disappear again. One quiet afternoon, Lily finally broke down in front of me. Her hands were shaking as she admitted how terrified she'd been, how tightly she'd held herself together until there was nothing left. I listened, but I didn't forgive her right away. But let me go back to the beginning. I was a widow, living in an apartment on the 4th floor. I had lived there for so long that I knew every creak of the floorboards, and I could recognize my neighbors by the sound of their footsteps. I had stopped locking the door when I went out to check the mail. It was a simple life, but it was mine. One morning, I came back from a doctor's appointment with a paper bag of prescriptions. The hallway smelled the same as always, a faint mix of old paint and something metallic. The overhead lights flickered once and then settled. Nothing seemed unusual. I slid my key into the lock without looking. It didn't turn. At first, I blamed my hands. I had arthritis, and it made me doubt simple things. I adjusted my grip and tried again, slower this time. The key scraped against the metal, stiff and unfamiliar. I stepped back and stared at the door. The number was right, the scuffed corner near the handle was still there, and the faint scratch my late husband had made while carrying in a bookshelf was still visible. I knocked softly at first, then harder. My knuckles stung as the sound echoed down the hallway, but no one answered. A thin wave of unease crept into my chest. I reached for my phone and called Jake. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. It was Lily. Her tone was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. "You shouldn't be there," she said. The locks were changed. I laughed quietly because the words didn't make sense. What do you mean changed? I asked. There was a pause on the other end. Then she said, Jake agreed to it. You don't live there anymore. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow. I pressed my back against the wall, my phone cold in my hand, and the paper bag slipped from my fingers and brushed the floor. I stood there, staring at the door I had opened thousands of times before, trying to understand how a place that had held my life for 2 decades could shut me out without warning, and how my own son could let it happen. I don't remember exactly when the call ended. I only remember lowering the phone and realizing my hand was shaking. For a few seconds, I stood there, half expecting the door to open on its own, as if this were some kind of misunderstanding that would correct itself if I waited long enough. But the hallway was quiet, except for the faint hum of electricity in the lights above me. Someone's television murmured behind a closed door down the hall, and somewhere below, an elevator chimed. Life went on. I knocked again, slower this time. My knuckles were sore, but still nothing. That was when it sank in. I was standing outside my own home with nowhere to go. I had no coat, and my purse was still inside the apartment. The only things I had were my phone, my keys, and the paper bag of prescriptions that I suddenly couldn't afford to lose. I sat down on the stairwell because my legs no longer felt steady. The steps were cold through my skirt. I pressed my back against the wall and stared at the floor, trying to breathe evenly, the way my late husband used to remind me to do whenever I felt overwhelmed. I told myself Jake would call back. He had to. This couldn't be his decision. He wouldn't do this without telling me. He wouldn't let me find out like this. But the minutes passed, and my phone stayed silent. A woman from the 3rd floor walked past me carrying groceries. She slowed when she saw me sitting there, hesitated as if she might ask if I was all right, then kept walking. I couldn't blame her. I wouldn't have known what to say either. It was Mrs. Jenkins who finally found me. She came up the stairs carrying a canvas tote bag, stopped short when she saw me, and set it down without a word. She didn't ask questions. She didn't rush me. She simply sat beside me and placed a hand over mine. You're cold, she said quietly. That was when I realized I was. She helped me to my feet and took me to her apartment. It was smaller than mine, cluttered with books and old photographs, but it was warm. She made tea while I sat at her kitchen table. My hands wrapped around the mug as if it were something solid I could hold on to. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out tangled. Changed locks. Jake agreed. You don't live there anymore. Each sentence sounded stranger when spoken out loud, as if I were repeating lines from someone else's story. Mrs. Jenkins listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. You should stay here tonight, she said. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. That night, I slept on her couch. Or rather, I lay there staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in slow, uneven circles. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the door, the number on it, the lock that refused to turn. Sometime after midnight, I checked my phone again. Still nothing from Jake. In the early morning hours, doubt crept in. Maybe I had misunderstood something. Maybe there was paperwork I'd forgotten about. I had signed documents before at Jake's request, trusting him to explain what mattered. He'd always been good with details. He'd always told me he was looking out for me. By the time the sun rose, the doubt had curdled into something heavier. After breakfast, Mrs. Jenkins walked back upstairs with me. I wanted to see the apartment in daylight, as if that might change something. The door looked the same as it always had, except for the new lock. Sleek, modern, unmistakably intentional. I knocked this time. The door opened just a few inches. Lily stood there, her hand still on the knob, her body angled so I couldn't see inside. She held out a large envelope. Jake asked me to give you this, she said. I took it with stiff fingers and opened it right there in the hallway. Inside were copies of legal documents. My name appeared more than once, printed neatly beneath signatures I recognized as my own. A transfer of ownership. I felt the air leave my lungs. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely audible. You signed it last year, she replied. Her eyes flicked down the hallway, then back to me. We talked about this. I remembered the conversation then. Jake had mentioned paperwork, something about simplifying things in case of emergencies. I had trusted him. I hadn't read every page. I need my purse, I said. My things. You can come back later, she said. We'll arrange a time. Before I could respond, the door closed softly between us. I stood there holding the envelope, the hallway suddenly too bright, too exposed, knowing for the first time that whatever had happened wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. Mrs. Jenkins insisted we see a lawyer. We went to Mr. Harris's office, which was above a small coffee shop on Elm Street. The smell of coffee followed us up the narrow staircase. I remember thinking how ordinary everything felt, how wrong it seemed that something so life-altering could be handled in a room with beige walls and mismatched chairs. Mr. Harris was polite in the careful way people are when they already know the answer isn't going to be good. He read through the document slowly, his glasses sliding down his nose as he turned each page. These were signed legally, he said at last. Your son is the sole owner of the apartment. I asked him if that meant I had no rights at all. He folded his hands on the desk. Unless you can prove coercion or fraud, your options are very limited, he said. The words sounded clean and distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. I stared at the edge of his desk at a faint scratch in the wood and tried to remember the day I had signed those papers. I remembered Jake sitting across from me at my kitchen table, telling me it was just to make things easier. I remembered trusting him because he was my son. Where am I supposed to live? I asked. Mr. Harris didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer. You'll need to make other arrangements. When we left the office, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time, as if something essential had been taken from me, but my body hadn't caught up yet. Mrs. Jenkins walked beside me without speaking. Outside, people were lining up at the coffee shop, laughing, deciding what to order. That afternoon, Lily called. She didn't apologize. She didn't raise her voice either. She spoke the way people do when they think they're being generous. Jake and I talked, she said. We're willing to help you get back on your feet. She explained that they would give me some money, $5,000, enough to help with a deposit somewhere else. In return, I would agree not to contest anything and to collect my belongings within a limited time frame. I asked how much. She told me the amount. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough to replace a home or a sense of security. It felt like a price placed on my silence. I need my things, I said. You can come tomorrow afternoon, she replied. I'll be there. The next day, Mrs. Jenkins drove me back. I watched the building approach through the windshield, my stomach tightening with every block. The door opened when Lily unlocked it, but she didn't step aside. She stood there as if guarding something. You can take what you need, she said. We've already packed some of it. Inside, the apartment felt unfamiliar. Furniture had been moved. The pictures on the walls were gone. Cardboard boxes sat stacked near the door, each one labeled in thick marker. I went first to the bedroom. My dresser drawers were empty. The space where my husband's photograph had always stood was bare. I opened a closet and found only a few coats that weren't mine. Some items were donated, Lily said from behind me. Things you probably didn't need anymore. The words stung more than I expected. I moved slowly through the rooms, opening boxes, closing them again when I saw what was missing. Letters, small keepsakes, things that didn't look important to anyone else. In the living room, I saw Ethan sitting on the couch. He held a video game controller but wasn't playing. When he looked up and saw me, his face fell. I knelt in front of him without thinking. "It's okay," I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. He leaned forward and whispered, "I'm sorry, Grandma." Before I could ask him what he meant, Lily called his name sharply from the kitchen. He flinched and looked away. I stood up, my chest tight, and realized how little space I truly had there. Every movement felt observed. Every second felt borrowed. By the time we left, I had only a few boxes and a suitcase. As Mrs. Jenkins loaded them into the car, I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the windows. Somewhere behind them was the life I had built, reduced to what could be carried away in one trip. That night, back in Mrs. Jenkins's apartment, I opened the suitcase and stared at its contents. Clothing, toiletries, a handful of photographs I had managed to rescue. I lay awake listening to the city settle around me, understanding something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't just about property or paperwork. I had been erased from my own life. And if I wanted to survive what came next, I would have to learn how to exist without the safety I had spent years believing would never be taken from me. The first thing I learned after losing my home was how loud silence could be. Mrs. Jenkins never complained about having me there, but I could feel myself taking up space that wasn't meant for me. I folded my blankets every morning. I washed my cup as soon as I finished my tea. I tried to make myself smaller, quieter, easier to live with. It didn't change the fact that I was sleeping on someone else's couch. I spent my days looking for a place of my own. The numbers never worked out the way I hoped they would. Rent had risen while my savings had not. Every listing came with requirements I couldn't meet or prices that made my chest tighten. When I called about part-time work, the conversations always ended politely the same way. They thanked me for my interest and told me they'd be in touch. They never were. Eventually, I accepted a job doing overnight companion care for an elderly woman a few miles away. The work wasn't physically demanding, mostly sitting beside her bed, reminding her to take her medication, listening when she woke, confused in the dark. The pay was modest, but it was something I could rely on. On my days off, I started going to a free meditation class at the community center. I didn't tell anyone why I was there. I told myself it was for my mind, for my peace. The truth was, I needed somewhere to be that wasn't Mrs. Jenkins's living room. The people in the class didn't ask questions either. They smiled. They made room for me on the mat for an hour at a time. I focused on breathing instead of remembering. Weeks passed. Jake didn't call. Sometimes my phone would light up with his name, only for the call to end before I could answer. Once I managed to catch it. "Mom," he said quickly. His voice sounded tight, unfamiliar. "I can't talk long. I just want to say, I'll explain soon." Before I could ask what he meant, the call ended. That night, I sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the blank television screen, replaying his words. Explain soon. None of it made sense. And yet, something in his tone unsettled me more than anger would have. Not long after that, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a drawing from Ethan. It showed a building with a large door and a heavy lock drawn in thick black lines. Outside the door stood a small figure with gray hair. Inside another figure stood behind the lock, their face scribbled over. In the corner of the page, Ethan had written, "I miss you." I sat there holding the paper, my throat tight, wondering how much my grandson understood and how much he was being asked to keep quiet about. By then, I had found a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just one room with a narrow kitchen and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in, but it was mine. I signed the lease with hands that shook only a little. The first night I slept there, the walls felt too close. Every sound startled me. But when I woke in the morning, I realized something important. No one could lock me out of this place. I began to settle into a routine. Work at night, meditation during the day, coffee with a woman from the class who had also lost her husband. Small things that stitched my days together again. Still, the questions followed me. Why had Jake really done this? Why had Lily been so cold, so precise, as if every word had been rehearsed? Why did Ethan look at me like he was carrying something heavy? The anger I'd felt at first softened into something more complicated. Hurt, confusion, a dull ache that didn't go away. But then, that call from Mr. Harris came, and everything changed. Now, as I sit here with the keys in my hand, I know that what happened changed me, but it did not erase me. I learned how to stand without leaning on promises that could be taken back. The door that closed taught me something the open ones never had. It taught me to choose myself, even when doing so felt lonely and frightening.